Jerome Bettis, a Super Bowl champion, more than a decade of relentless play in the NFL, an unshakable symbol of strength for the Pittsburgh Steelers, a living machine that redefined the meaning of resilience in American football. From his unrelenting straight-ahead charges through defensive lines to his heavy, unstoppable runs, he conquered one of the harshest stages on the planet with discipline, power, and an iron will that never surrendered. Millions admired him as a symbol of perseverance and courage. But behind that glory was a story that was not glamorous but full of endurance. A body that never truly belonged to a perfect athlete. Silent asthma attacks that squeezed every breath. Training sessions that had to stop when his lungs could no longer keep up with his heart. Games where every step was a battle with his own chest. Years of doubt, being judged as too slow, too heavy, not fit enough to survive at the highest level. Moments when he stood on the field, under bright lights, but inside it was only the effort to keep his breath from shattering. No one saw that. No one heard the rapid breathing behind the helmet. No one knew that every collision was not just pain, but a risk that could stop him from continuing. His career was not built on perfection, but on limits he never accepted. He was not the fastest, not the lightest, not the ideal model, but he was the one who never stopped. He ran when his body demanded rest. He stood up when everything inside wanted to collapse. He continued when every sign said it was time to end. And over the years, the image of the bus became something bigger than sports, a symbol of moving forward even when there was no guarantee ahead. But the truth remained there, quiet and undeniable. That body was never born to endure what it had been through. And now, when the stadium lights have gone out, when the cheers are only fading memories, when life slows down and silence begins to fill the gaps, one question still echoes, heavy and not easy to answer. What really kept Jerome Bettis going when his own body was never created to go that far? Please hit like and subscribe to the channel to continue following the journey of a man who was never born to endure, but still never stopped. Because what you are about to hear is not just a story about football, but a story about how a man kept moving forward, even as his own body was gradually rejecting him. Detroit was not a place for children allowed to be weak, and for Jerome Bettis, that was not a metaphor, but a reality present in every street, every cold morning, every judging look he faced as a boy. That city did not give anyone time to slow down, did not wait for anyone to weaken, and certainly did not tolerate those who could not keep up with its harsh rhythm. In an ordinary working family, love was not shown through gentle words or indulgence, but through discipline, high standards, and expectations that were not allowed to fail. His parents did not teach him how to become a star, they taught him how to survive, how to stand firm, and how to never become a burden in a world that was already too heavy. But from a young age, his body whispered something else, something he did not want to hear, that he was not like other children, that there was some limit inside that he could not see but could always feel clearly in every breath. The first asthma attacks came without warning, squeezing his chest, making air a luxury, making every inhale feel like an effort to prolong existence for a few more seconds. While other children ran, laughed, collided, and stood up without thinking, he had to stop, bend over, try to regain his breath in the silence that no one really understood. No one saw that fear. No one understood the feeling when you wanted to continue, but your body would not allow it. And in a city like Detroit, where strength was the minimum standard, that difference was not something acceptable. He soon realized that if he did not keep up, he would be left behind, not in a symbolic sense, but truly left behind the streets, behind the opportunities, behind a life he had not yet touched. That fear was not loud, not explosive, but it existed, smoldering, persistent, and growing with him. There were afternoons when he stood watching other children play ball, wanting to join, wanting to prove he could too, but held back by his own body, by an unstable breath, by a feeling he could not explain to anyone. And it was in those moments that something began to form, not confidence, but a silent decision that he was not allowed to fail, that no matter what happened, No matter how much his body protested, he still had to find a way to continue. No one said that to him. No lesson was taught with words. But life in Detroit, his family, and those asthma attacks themselves taught him one thing very clearly, that if he accepted his limits, everything would end before it even began. And so he began to learn to live with the fear, not to overcome it completely, but so it would not stop him. Every time he could not breathe, he learned to wait and stand up. Every time he fell behind, he learned to turn around and keep running. Every time he felt he was not enough, he reminded himself that there was no other choice but to move forward. That was not the strength the world would later praise. That was a quiet endurance, a will built not from victories, but from the fear of being left behind. And over time, that not only helped him survive, but also shaped the person he would become. A person who went far not because he had no limits, but because he did not accept letting those limits decide his stopping point. The teenage years came without bringing relief, but only made everything clearer. Because for Jerome Bettis, his body did not get stronger in the way he needed. It only became more unpredictable, heavier, and sometimes betrayed him at the most important moments, when he began to take sports seriously, when training sessions became harsher, when the pace was no longer a game but real competition. The asthma attacks were no longer small interruptions, but became invisible walls blocking all his efforts. There were days he stepped onto the field with determination to prove himself, but after just a few runs, his chest tightened, the air seemed to disappear, and he was forced to stop while others continued, kept running, kept fighting, kept moving forward as if nothing could stop them. No one said it, but everyone saw it. The coach's eyes were no longer patient, but doubtful. The teammates' eyes were no longer waiting, but an unspoken question. Was he good enough to be here? In a world where strength was measured by the ability to endure, having to stop, even once, was enough to put someone in a different group, the group of those not good enough, not tough enough, not reliable enough, when things mattered. And the most painful thing was not those looks, but the feeling that he too began to believe them. There were evenings he lay still, listening to his own breathing, wondering if this body really belonged to the path he was trying to follow, wondering if all those efforts were fighting against a limit he could not break. Every time he could not finish a training session, every time he had to leave the field earlier than others, every time he had to stand and watch instead of participate, the feeling of being left behind became clearer, heavier, and more dangerous than ever. But it was in those moments that a choice began to form, not loud, not heroic, just a silent decision he repeated in his head, that he would not accept the role of the weaker one, that he would not let his body define who he was, no matter how many times it tried to pull him back. He began to learn to hide it, to continue even when not fully recovered, to push himself past limits that others might respect, but he would not. There were days he returned to the field as soon as he could breathe, even if his heart rate was not stable, even if his body was not ready, because he understood that in that environment, if he waited until perfect, he would never have a chance. The difference between him and others no longer lay in talent, but in the level he was willing to endure, and gradually, that changed how he saw himself. He no longer tried to be the fastest or the strongest. He began to become the one who never stopped, the one who could stand up one more time when he should rest, the one who could continue when every signal in his body was demanding to stop. But the price of that choice was not small. Every time he pushed past the limit, he moved closer to a point he could not see, a point where his body would no longer cooperate, a point where all those efforts could collapse in a moment. And deep inside, he knew that. He knew this was not a war he could win completely, but he also knew that if he did not fight, he would lose from the start. So he continued. Not because he was not afraid, but because he feared being left behind more than anything else. When the teenage years gradually transitioned to the stage where everything began to be evaluated more seriously, Jerome Bettis no longer only had to face his own body, but also had to face how the world looked at him, and that was sometimes heavier than any asthma attack. In training sessions, in games, in every time he stepped onto the field, there was always an invisible comparison happening. Without words, but everyone understood. Those who ran faster, lighter, more agile, those who seemed born to the mold that modern football required. And then there was him, a beat slower, a bit heavier, not carrying the look of a star in the way people expected. Comments began to appear, at first mild, then clearer, repeated until they became part of the atmosphere around him. That he was not fast enough, that he did not fit the standard, that if he continued like this, he would not go far. Not everyone said it directly, but what he heard was enough to understand how he was being perceived. And that began to sink into his thoughts, not as a truth he accepted, but as a pressure he could not avoid. He began to wonder if they were right, if everything he was trying was going against a reality he could not change. There were moments he stood alone after training, looking back at what he had done, trying to find what was still missing, what needed to change, what needed to be sacrificed to continue surviving in an environment that waited for no one. And gradually, another decision formed, no longer trying to become like others, but finding a way to turn what people saw as weaknesses into the only thing he could rely on. If he could not be faster, he would be stronger. If he could not be lighter, he would become impossible to pull down. If he could not fit the standard, he would force the standard to change when facing him. That was not an easy choice, because it required him to accept that he would always be doubted, always questioned, always have to prove more than others just to stand on equal ground with them. But that was the only path he had. He began to change the way he played, change the way he moved, learn to use his body weight as an advantage instead of a burden, learn to charge straight into opponents instead of dodging, learn to hold every step like each one was a battle that had to be won. And over time, that began to make a difference, not in a way that made everyone immediately recognize him, but in a way that made them unable to ignore him anymore. But even when his runs began to attract attention, even when his strength became something opponents had to face, inside nothing changed. The asthma attacks were still there, waiting, silent, without warning. Every time he stepped onto the field, he was not only preparing for the opponent in front, but also preparing for the possibility that his body could betray him at any moment. There were games where, from the start, he felt the heaviness in his chest, a sign he was too familiar with, but could never really accept. And in those moments, everything became clearer than ever, that everything he had built, everything he was trying to hold on to, could be taken away just because of something he could not control. But he still continued. He always continued. Not because he believed he was invincible, but because he did not allow himself to stop just because others thought he should. Every time he was told he was not enough, he found a way to prove he was still there. Every time his body pulled him back, he found a way to take one more step. And gradually, that not only shaped how he played, but also shaped the person he became, a person who no longer sought recognition from others, but only focused on not becoming what they had said. But deep inside, he knew this battle had no clear ending. There was no moment where he could stand still and say he had won completely, because every time he stepped onto the field, every time he put himself in that position, the battle started over, with the same doubts, the same limits, and the same question he still could never answer with certainty: whether he could continue how much longer before everything finally caught up with him. When stepping into the years at the University of Notre Dame, Jerome Bettis carried not only the dream of playing at a higher level, but also everything he had tried to overcome before. But instead of finding stability, he stepped into an environment where everything became harsher, faster, and more ruthless than anything he had experienced, where every training session was no longer an opportunity to improve, but a continuous test of who deserved to stay and who would be replaced. And in such a system, there was no room for weakness, no room for days when the body was not ready, no room for those who needed more time to catch up. There, he was no longer a boy trying to prove himself, but one of many competing for the same position, the same opportunity, the same dream, and that made everything more fragile than ever. Nothing was certain. Nothing was guaranteed. Every time he stepped onto the field, he knew that just one bad day, one imperfect training session, one moment when his body could not keep up, everything could change. The coaches did not much, but the way they observed, the way they made decisions, the way they chose who would play, who would sit out, all sent a clear message that trust was not something given once and kept forever. It had to be proven every day, every training session, every time he touched the ball. And for him, that became harder than for anyone else, because he not only had to compete with those around him, he also had to compete with his own body, a body that could slow him down at any time, could make him not complete a full training session, could make him look like a risky choice in the eyes of those seeking stability. There were days he played well, well enough to make people notice, well enough to make them think maybe he deserved this opportunity. But then there were days when everything became harder, when his breath was no longer steady, when the pace could not be maintained, when what he had done before no longer seemed enough to protect his position. And that made the dream he pursued never really bring a sense of safety. It always came with a fear that everything he had could disappear in just a moment he could not control. The doubts did not disappear as he went further, they only changed form, from direct words to silent decisions, from straightforward comments to opportunities withdrawn, and he understood that in the eyes of the system, he was not the perfect choice. He was an option that needed consideration, a person who could make a difference, but could also become a risk. And that forced him to live in a state with no room for comfort, no room for accepting that he was good enough. Every day he had to prove it from the beginning. Every time he touched the ball, he had to remind everyone that he was still there. But deep inside, he knew that might never be enough, because prejudice was not easily erased by a few good moments, and in an environment where everything was measured by stability, any sign of uncertainty could become a reason for him to be replaced. And so the NFL dream he pursued was never a journey toward clear glory. It was like walking on a thin rope, where every step had to be careful, where every mistake could be the last step, where even when he moved forward, he still always felt like he was very close to the edge of something that could take everything away. And that feeling, the feeling that everything could collapse at any time, became an inseparable part of how he viewed his career, not as a sure path to success, but as a series of moments he had to hold on to with everything he had. Because he knew better than anyone else that just letting go once, just slowing down one step, the dream he had spent his whole life pursuing could disappear before he realized it. And then when the NFL door finally opened, when the name Jerome Bettis was called on draft day, that should have been the moment all doubts ended. That should have been the time he could breathe a sigh of relief and believe that everything he had endured finally had meaning, but instead of certainty, he stepped into an even colder world, where the dream was no longer measured by whether you got there or not, but by how long you could survive before being replaced. And at the Los Angeles Rams, he quickly realized that being selected did not mean being understood. The system he entered was not built for someone like him, not for a running back based on strength, on stubbornness, on the ability to endure, but prioritized speed, agility, things he was always told he did not have enough of. And in that environment, he was not placed in a position to showcase what he had, but was required to become a different version of himself, a version he had never really been. Every time he stepped onto the field, he not only had to prove he was good enough, but also had to try to fit a mold not created for him, and that gradually eroded the confidence he had carried from the years before. His performance began to fluctuate, not because he lost ability, but because he was not placed where that ability could exist, and in a league where results were everything. No one cared about the reasons behind. They only looked at the numbers, at what showed on the stats. And those numbers were not enough to protect him from the doubts returning, stronger, clearer, And this time, they did not come from outsiders, but from the very system he was trying to belong to. There were days he stood on the sidelines, watching the game happen without him in it, clearly feeling the distance between the dream he once pursued and the reality he was living, a gap not measurable by geographic distance, but by the feeling of being out of place when you were exactly where you wanted to be, but did not belong there. And it was in those moments that a thought began to appear, slowly but unavoidably, that maybe what people had said was true, that maybe he was not really suited for the NFL, that maybe everything he had done was only enough to bring him here, but not enough to keep him. That thought did not come once and disappear. It came back, in unsatisfying training sessions, in times he was not called, in conversations where he was no longer the center, in the way everything around him continued moving forward without him. And what made it dangerous was not that it existed, but that it began to make sense. Because when you had done everything you could, when you had endured more than others, just to have the chance to stand on equal ground with them, yet still could not find your place, it was very hard not to wonder if the problem was with yourself. There were nights he sat alone, not because there was no one around, but because there were no clear enough answers, wondering if the path he had taken really led to where he thought, wondering if he was fighting to move forward or just delaying the inevitable. And for the first time in his life, the dream he had held tightly began to carry a different feeling, no longer just hope, but the fear of losing everything, not losing what he did not have, but losing the very opportunity to prove he belonged here. But even in that doubt, he still did not stop. He did not know if he could change how things were happening or not, did not know if the system would ever really fit him or not, but he knew one thing he had learned long before, that stopping was not an option. And so he continued, not with certainty, but with an almost desperate determination that if there was any chance, no matter how small, he would not be the one to miss it. And it was in the period when everything seemed to be drifting away from him the most, when others' belief in him faded, and his own belief was tested to the limit, that a change began to approach, not like a reward, but like a final chance he was not even sure he deserved, but a chance he could not let pass. And then what he had feared all that time finally happened, not loud, not dramatic like in the dreams he once had, but in a cold, brief, and decisive way, like how a system decided that a name was no longer needed when Jerome Bettis was traded from the Los Angeles Rams, not as part of a grand plan he was trusted with, but like an adjustment, a replacement, a decision showing that what he had done was not enough to keep him. There was no explanation that really soothed that, no way to interpret it as a positive opportunity, when inside he was left with a very clear feeling that he had been eliminated, that the dream he had not fought to achieve was being taken away, not because he did not try, but because he did not fit. And that was the most painful thing, not failure, but being seen as a mistake. There were moments he looked back at the years before, the training sessions he had tried to push through when he could not breathe, the games where he had forced himself to continue though his body could no longer endure, and wondered if all that meant anything, if the final result was still being pushed out, as if he had never really belonged there. That feeling did not come like a storm, but like an emptiness, a prolonged silence, where everything around continued, but he stood still, not because he wanted to, but because he did not know where to go next. In that moment, for the first time in his entire journey, the thought of giving up was no longer distant. It did not appear as a clear choice, but as accumulated fatigue, as a repeated question whether continuing was still worth it. Because if everything he had done was still not enough, if even after enduring more than others, he was still seen as unnecessary, then what else was there to prove? No one told him he should stop, but no one said he should still continue either. And that very gap, the gap between no longer being trusted and not yet completely giving up, was where he had to face himself most clearly. No more stadium noise, no more pace of training sessions, no more pressure to prove anything to others. Only one question left that he could not avoid. whether he still believed in himself or not. There were days he could not answer that question. There were moments he looked into the future and saw nothing clear, only a path he was not sure he still belonged on. And that made everything heavier than any asthma attack he had ever experienced, because this time, it was not his body betraying him, but circumstances pushing him out of the place he had tried to reach. But even in that silence, in the feeling of being left behind, one thing did not change, one thing that had followed him from the very first days, that he did not know how to stop. Not because he did not want to, but because he could not. He could be eliminated, could be misjudged, could be seen as an unsuccessful decision, but that did not automatically erase everything he had built inside himself. And so, even without certainty, even without guarantees, even without promises that things would get better, he still stood there, between the silence and the doubt, trying to find a reason to continue. Not because he knew what was waiting ahead, but because he was not ready to accept that his journey had ended this way. And it was in the moment when everything seemed to have closed, when he was closest to letting go of everything, that another door began to open. Not loud, not certain, but enough to create a choice he could not ignore. An opportunity not to start over from the beginning, but to prove that he had never really been a mistake, just not yet in the right place where he could become himself. And then that opportunity appeared not like a sure promise, but like a turn that Jerome Bettis had to take if he still wanted to continue. When he joined the Pittsburgh Steelers, a team with a clear identity, with a heavy history, with standards not for those still searching for themselves. And from the very first moment, he understood that this was not just a new opportunity, but possibly the last one. No more room for hesitation, no more time to try and fail, no more right to slow down to adjust. Everything had to happen immediately, and he had to prove he deserved to stay. Not with words, but with every run, every collision, every time he stood up when he should have collapsed. That mindset changed how he stepped into every training session, every game. He no longer played to seek recognition. He played like someone with nothing left to lose, as if every time he held the ball could be the last, as if every run was a refusal to everything that had ever said he was not enough. And it was in that state that something began to form, not a taught tactic, not a trained skill, but a way of existing, a way of playing born from endurance. People began to call him the Buzz. Not because he was fast, not because he was agile, but because he did not stop. Because he kept moving forward even when everything around tried to pull him back. Every one of his runs was not a beautiful performance, but a battle, where he carried the full weight of his body, of the pressure, of the years of doubt, charging straight into the defense, as if that was the only way to prove he was still here. But inside, nothing became easier. The asthma attacks did not disappear just because he changed teams. His body did not suddenly become perfect just because he had a new opportunity. Every game was still a test, not only of strength, but of the ability to endure, of how long he could hold his breath, how many more steps he could take before everything began to slow down. And that made every success, no matter how small, have to be paid for with more than what others could see. Trust did not return immediately. It came slowly, bit by bit, through training sessions he did not quit, through games where he did not disappear, through moments where he did what people before thought he could not. Teammates began to see him differently, not as a risk, but as someone they could rely on. Coaches began to trust more, not because he was perfect, but because he did not abandon his position when things got tough. But even when things began to change from the outside, inside he still kept a feeling he could not remove, the fear of failure. It did not disappear when he played better. It did not leave when he began to be recognized. It only changed shape, from the fear of not being chosen to the fear of not keeping what he had. Every time he stepped onto the field, he still carried the old question, whether today would be the day everything collapsed or not, whether his body would decide it had endured enough or not. And that was exactly what made him never allow himself to be comfortable. No game was safe, no moment was certain. Everything had to be held on to, step by step, run by run. And over time, that created a person the world began to see. A person who was not only physically strong, but also unstoppable in spirit. But the truth no one saw was that he never felt he had escaped the risk. He only learned to live with it, carrying it with him as an inseparable part of who he was. And so, every step of progress he achieved was not liberation, but a reminder that he was still on that path, a path he had to keep walking, not because it became easier, but because he had never allowed himself to stop, even when deep inside he knew that just one wrong moment, everything could return to the point where he had once stood, where everything could disappear without any warning. And then when Jerome Bettis's runs began to deliver results, when his name was no longer mentioned with doubt but with respect instead, something else was also quietly growing at the same time, a price that no one really saw. Because success did not come alone, it brought demands that his body had to bear every day, every game, every season, and gradually everything began to change in a way he could not control. The runs were still there, the strength was still there, but inside his body no longer responded the way it used to. Every time he stepped onto the field, it was no longer complete confidence, but preparation for what might happen if things did not go as desired. There were games where from the very first minutes, he felt something unusual, a heaviness in his chest, an uneven breath, a familiar sign but one that never became easier. And in those moments he had no choice but to continue, because the game did not stop just because he was not ready. He learned to control every breath as if it were part of the strategy, learned to hide the difficulty behind the helmet, learned to stand firm when everything inside was swaying. There were times he had to use medication right on the sidelines, quickly, discreetly, as if it were something that should not exist in the world he was competing in, because there, people did not talk about what was not perfect, they only talked about what showed on the field, about the runs, the yards gained, the victories, and everything outside the lights did not exist in the story people wanted to hear. But for him, what happened behind the scenes was what defined every game. Every time he held the ball, it was not just an offensive play, but a decision, an acceptance that his body might not go all the way with him, an acceptance that any moment could be the moment when everything stopped. And that did not happen once. It repeated, in many games, in many seasons, in the nights when he left the field feeling he had overcome another challenge, but also knowing that challenge would return, maybe sooner, maybe stronger. No one saw that. No one saw the minutes he sat alone after the game, trying to regain a normal breathing rhythm, trying to convince himself that he could still continue. No one saw the mornings when his body reacted slower, heavier, as if reminding him that everything had a limit. And that very invisibility made his pain even more lonely, because he not only had to endure it, but also had to hide it, had to make sure no one saw a weaker version of himself, because in that environment, a sign of weakness could be enough to change how people viewed him. And so he continued to carry it, carry every asthma attack, every unstable breath, every fear he could not speak, stepping into every game as if it were normal, as if it were just part of the job. But deep inside, he knew it was not normal. He knew that what he was doing was not the way everyone else had to do to survive here. And that was exactly what made every success of his heavier, because it was not just the result of talent or effort, but the result of constant endurance, of refusing to listen to his body when it asked to stop. Every game that passed brought him closer to a limit he could not see clearly, but could feel, a point where everything could collapse without warning, a moment when everything he had built could end just because of something he could not control. And the scariest thing was not that it could happen, but that he knew it would happen at some point, he just did not know when. But until then, he still continued, not because he believed he was invincible, but because he had gotten used to living on the fragile line between continuing and stopping. And that very line, thin, unstable, always ready to shatter, had become the place where he existed, where every run was not just moving forward, but once again delaying what he knew one day could no longer be delayed. And over time, what had once been silent endurance began to leave clearer traces on Jerome Bettis's body. No longer just asthma attacks that came and went, but accumulated injuries, pains that no longer completely disappeared after each game, signs that his body sent more and more frequently, as if reminding him that everything had a limit, that no one could continue forever this way without paying a price. Every season that passed, he still stepped onto the field, still ran, still collided, still did what the world expected from someone like him, but inside, everything was no longer the same as before. The strength was still there, but it no longer came naturally. Every run required more effort. Every collision left more consequences. There were days his body no longer responded as he wanted, a beat slower, a bit heavier, as if pulling him back, as if trying to tell him it was time to stop. But that was a message he was never really ready to listen to. The pressure came not only from opponents, but from his own position on the team, from having to maintain performance, from having to prove he was still someone the team could trust, even when there were younger, faster, stronger players waiting behind, ready to step up if he just slowed down a little. No one said it directly, but he felt it in every decision, in every training session, in the way opportunities were divided, in the way time on the field became something to be earned rather than taken for granted. And that created a pressure he could not escape, because this time it was not just about proving he deserved it, but about not losing what he had gained after so many years. There were evenings he left the field with an aching body, not just from collisions, but from accumulated fatigue, a fatigue that did not disappear after a night of rest, but followed him into the next day, into the next week, into the entire season. There were moments he sat alone, not to think about strategy or the game, but just to listen to his body, trying to understand how much longer it could endure. And the answer was never clear, only a vague feeling that everything was changing in a direction he could not control. And along with that change, another worry began to grow, not the worry of failing in a game, but the worry of being replaced, being forgotten, being seen as part of the past while he was still trying to exist in the present. Younger players came into the team with new energy, with speed he could no longer match, with bodies not yet worn down by years of playing, and that forced him to face a reality he had to try to delay all this time. That time was not on his side. But what made it harder to accept was not time passing, but that he still felt he could contribute, still felt he was not done, that there was still something he needed to complete before he could stop. And that very inner conflict, between a body growing weaker and a will that still wanted to continue, created a prolonged state of tension, where every day became a negotiation between taking one more step forward and accepting that it might be time to stop. The fatigue was no longer just physical. It crept into his thoughts, into his emotions, into the way he saw himself. There were days he wondered if everything he was doing was worth it, if continuing to fight with a body that was gradually leaving him was still the right thing. But then that question was pushed aside, not because he found an answer, but because he had no other choice but to continue. Because for him, stopping was never a simple decision. It was not just leaving the field, but accepting that the journey had ended, that everything he had built had to be left behind. And that, for a person who had spent his whole life moving forward, was harder to accept than any pain. So he continued to step onto the field, continued to run, continued to endure. Not because everything became easier, but because he was not ready to face the moment when everything really ended. And while the world still saw a powerful, unstoppable the bus, inside he was gradually feeling a truth he had tried to delay for too long. That there were things that could not be kept forever, that there were battles that could not last forever, and that maybe, just maybe, these years were not only testing him, but taking more than what he once thought he was willing to trade. And then the moment Jerome Bettis had always known would come one day finally appeared. Not in the form of a major injury or an asthma attack that made him collapse. but in the form of a mistake that lasted only a few seconds, but was enough to shake everything he had built. A fumble in an important game when the ball slipped from his hands in a way that no one, not even himself, could believe. Time seemed to stop in that moment, not in a metaphorical sense, but a real feeling when all sounds around disappeared, when the cheers turned into a heavy silence, when he saw the ball rolling away and knew that everything could change right then. In a long career, there were so many runs, so many collisions, so many moments he had to fight to keep his position, but never had he felt so close to losing everything as in that second. Not because he was not strong enough, not because his body betrayed him, but because of a simple mistake, a moment when things did not happen as he had done thousands of times before. And that was exactly what made it more cruel. Because there was no explanation that could soothe that feeling, no way to go back and fix the moment that had just happened. Teammates looked at him, not with anger, but with a tension he could clearly feel. The fans reacted, not because they understood the whole story, but because they saw the result, and that result could change the entire game. But the greatest pressure did not come from outside. It came from himself, from the way he looked at himself in that moment, from the question he could not avoid, whether this was how everything ended. In a career where he had fought every day to hold his position, just one moment like that could become the final definition of him. Not all the things he had done right, but one thing he had done wrong. And that made everything heavier than any pressure he had ever experienced. He stood there, in the middle of the field, under the lights, among thousands of eyes, but felt completely alone, as if all the years before had led him to this exact moment to see what he would do next. There was a part of him that wanted to stop, not because he could not continue, but because he did not want to face the consequences of that mistake, did not want to take another step while knowing everything might have changed. But there was another part, the part he had built through every year, through every doubt, through every time his body pulled him back. That part did not allow him to walk away. And that very inner struggle between the mistake and the chance to redeem it, between acceptance and continuation, happened inside him while the game continued, while time did not really stop as he felt. This was no longer just a game. This was a challenge he could not prepare for, a moment where no strategy could help him overcome, only the decision he made in that very second. He could let this mistake define him, could let it become the reason for people to say he was not enough, that all the previous doubts finally had basis, or he could continue, accept that the mistake had happened, but not allow it to be the ending point. But continuing did not reduce the pain. It did not erase the image of the ball leaving his hands. It did not make him forget the feeling he had experienced in that moment. It only put him in a different position, where he had to carry that mistake with him, had to keep playing while knowing everything might have been different if only one small detail had changed. And that was the hardest thing, not making the mistake, but continuing after making the mistake, especially when that mistake could cost an entire career. But he still continued, not because he was sure he could fix it, not because he knew everything would be okay, but because he did not know how to do otherwise. He had come too far to stop here, had endured too much to let one moment, no matter how big, become the final period. And so he stepped forward, carrying the pressure, carrying the doubt, carrying the fear that it might be too late, but still stepped forward, because for him, the only choice had never changed, that no matter what happened, no matter how big the mistake, he still had to continue, because stopping, especially in a moment like this, was something he could never accept. And after the moment when everything almost collapsed, when the mistake still lingered in every thought, Jerome Bettis stepped into a decision that no longer relied on confidence, on the only thing he had left, the will to complete what he had started. When he chose to play one more season, even though his body was no longer intact as before, even though every sign showed that he had reached his limit long ago, this was no longer the decision of an athlete at his peak, but the decision of a man who knew clearly he was taking the final steps, A man who understood that every next game could be the last time he stepped onto the field, not because he wanted to end, but because his body might not give him any more chances. The days preparing for that season were no longer the same as before. No longer excitement. No longer the feeling of being ready to conquer, but a heavy silence, where every training session became a test of how much his body could still endure, where every run was no longer light, but carried the feeling of dragging along everything that had accumulated over many years. There were mornings he woke up and clearly felt that his body no longer belonged to him the way it once did, that what he asked it to do was no longer answered naturally, but required force, required endurance, required a level of sacrifice no one could see from the outside. And in that state, every game became a trade-off, no longer about gaining more yards, no longer about scoring more points, but about how much he was willing to take from his own body in exchange for one more time to continue. Every collision was not just a moment on the field, but a mark he would carry after the game, a reminder that this body was moving closer to its final limit. And what made it heavier was that he could not be sure how many more times like this he had left. There were games he stepped into with a thought he had never had before, that this could be the last time, he felt the rhythm of the game, the sound of collisions, the cheers, everything that had defined his life for so many years. And that thought did not bring relief, but brought another pressure, a pressure to make every moment meaningful, to not let any opportunity pass without using it, because he knew time was no longer on his side. But even when he played with the thought of the last time, the fear did not leave. It was still there, as an inseparable part, reminding him that just one wrong moment, one time his body did not respond, everything could end in a way he did not want. And the very coexistence of those two things, on one side the determination to complete, on the other the fear of losing everything, made every game a battle not only with opponents, but with time itself, with his own limits. And as the season continued, game by game, week by week, he gradually moved closer to what he had thought about, but never dared to be sure of, a chance to end the way he wanted when his team's journey led them to Super Bowl 40, not just a big game, but a destination, carrying everything he had been through, an opportunity not to prove himself to the world, but to prove to himself that everything he had endured, all the times he did not stop when he should have, finally had meaning. But even when standing before that opportunity, he still did not feel safe, because he understood that everything could still change, that his body could still be the final deciding factor, that this journey, no matter how far it had gone, was not really over yet. And so he stepped forward, not like a man certain of victory, but like a man trying to hold on to something fragile, something that could disappear at any time, but still worth trading everything to reach, even if only once. And then everything led to a night that Jerome Bettis knew could turn his life in a completely different direction. A night that was not only the final game of the season, but the convergence of everything he had experienced. When Super Bowl 40 was held right in Detroit, the very place where he had grown up, where everything began, where he had once been a child who had to learn how to breathe in a city that waited for no one. Nothing in his career carried such clear destiny as this moment, because it was not only the chance to win, but the chance to close a journey right where it was born, in front of the people, the streets, the memories that had shaped him from the very first days. But along with that was a pressure no previous game could compare to. It was no longer just team pressure, no longer just responsibility to teammates, but the pressure of the past, of everything he had ever been through, of all the times he almost stopped, almost gave up, almost disappeared before having the chance to stand here. When he stepped onto the field, the lights shone bright, the cheers rang out, but inside, everything became quieter than ever. Because in that moment, he did not only see the opponent in front, he saw himself from many years ago, a boy standing on the streets of Detroit, trying to breathe while others ran, a teenager who was doubted, a player who was cut, a man who had to fight his own body to not be left behind. All those versions existed together in him, stepped onto the field together that night, and that made every step heavier, not because he was weaker, but because he carried so much that he could not be light. The game began, and like every time he played, he collided, he ran. But the feeling this time was different, not because the opponent was stronger, but because the meaning of every moment had changed. Every time he held the ball, he knew it could be one of the last times. Every time he stood up after a collision, he knew his body was moving closer to the final limit, and that made everything sharper, clearer, as if time was slowing down just so he could feel every second passing. But at the same time, the fear was still there, not disappearing, not easing, but existing alongside hope, reminding him that everything could still end in a way he did not want, that just one mistake, one moment of losing control, everything could return to the point where he had once stood, where everything almost collapsed. And that very fragility made the game not just a competition, but a boundary between two different endings, one side completion, the other side unfinished. As time gradually moved toward the final seconds, as the result became clearer, as victory was no longer distant, he did not feel an explosion the way people usually imagine. There was no immediate overwhelming emotion, but a profound silence, as if everything inside him was trying to understand what had just happened. When the final whistle blew, when the team won, when everyone around began to celebrate, he stood there, not because he was not happy, but because this feeling was bigger than simple joy. It was not just the victory of one game, but the end of a journey he had not been sure he could reach. Memories came back, not as scattered images, but as a continuous flow, from the days he could not breathe, to the days he was doubted, to the moment he was cut, to the times he continued when he should have stopped, all converging in this moment, and what he felt was not glory, but liberation. Liberation from the question of whether he was enough or not. Liberation from the fear that everything could end without meaning. Liberation from the long battle between will and limits. And when he looked around, looked at the stands, looked at the city where he had started, he did not see just one victory. He saw a circle that had closed, a journey that had been completed in a way he had not dared to be sure would happen. But even in that moment, he still understood one thing, that if everything had been just a little different, if one of the previous moments had not happened the way it did, he might not be standing here, might not have had the chance to feel this. And that very awareness made this victory different. Not because it was perfect, but because it was so fragile that it almost did not exist. And when he finally allowed himself to feel the joy, it was not an explosion, but a profound relief, a quietness he had searched for many years. A moment where, for the first time in a very long time, he no longer needed to keep fighting. And then, after all the cheers gradually died down, after the stadium lights no longer shone on Jerome Bettis's every run, a silence began to appear, not loud, not sudden, but coming slowly, creeping into every day, every morning, every moment when he no longer had to prepare for any game. Life after retirement was not like what people imagine from the outside. There was no immediate emptiness, but also no prolonged excitement. Instead, there was a slowed rhythm of life, a silence he had not experienced for many years, a space with no more sounds of collisions, no more calls of plays, no more training sessions that lasted until the body could not continue. At first, that silence did not bring comfort. It made him realize he had gotten used to always having to move forward, always having to prepare, always having to fight, to the point that when everything stopped, he did not know what to do with himself. There was no more schedule to follow, no more goals to achieve next week, no more pressure to prove anything to anyone, and that very absence made him feel lost in a different way, no longer pushed out like before, but standing in a void he had never learned how to exist in. There were mornings he woke up early as habit, but there was nowhere to go, no reason to push his body past limits. And for the first time in many years, he had to face a question he had delayed for too long, that if he was no longer a player, who was he? That question was not easy to answer, because throughout his journey he had defined himself through what he did on the field, through the way he endured, through the way he did not stop when he should have. And when all of that was gone, he had to find himself again in a completely different way. But gradually, in that silence, something else began to appear, not as strong as what he had been through, but clear enough for him to realize that his life did not end with his career, it only changed shape. His role was no longer the ball carrier, no longer the one charging into defenses, but a husband, a father, a person present in moments he had often missed before, because he had to play, had to train, had to prepare for the next game. Family, which had always been there, but not always the center, now became the main support, became the place where he could put down everything he had carried for so many years. Meals were no longer rushed. Conversations were no longer interrupted by schedules. Simple moments like sitting together in the living room also carried a meaning he had not had time to notice before. But even when life began to stabilize in a new way, he still had to relearn something he had never been taught: how to live without constantly fighting. Because for him, fighting was not just part of the job, it was how he existed, how he faced the world, how he overcame his own limits. And when there was nothing left to fight, he had to learn to accept peace without feeling it was a void that needed to be filled. That did not come immediately. There were days he still felt a familiar urge, a feeling that he needed to do something, needed to move forward, needed to prove something, even though no one required it anymore. But over time, he began to understand that not every stage in life needed to be lived the same way. There were times when moving forward was necessary, but there were also times when stopping was the right thing. And stopping did not mean failure. It only meant the journey had reached a point where continuing was no longer necessary. He began to look back at what he had been through, not with regret, but with acceptance, that everything had happened the way it had to, that all the times he did not stop had led him here, to a life where he no longer needed to prove anything, no longer needed to run one more step to be recognized. And in that silence he found something he had not had for many years: not glory, not attention, but peace. A peace that did not come from having no difficulties, but from no longer having to fight everything around him to exist. And for the first time, he did not need to run, did not need to prove, did not need to continue just because he feared being left behind. He just needed to live. And that, for a person who had spent his whole life not stopping, was perhaps the hardest challenge he had ever had to overcome. And in the silence he had learned to accept, when there were no more collisions, no more pressure to step onto the field, a truth gradually became clearer than ever for Jerome Bettis, not like a newly discovered secret, but like something he had always known but had never really said, that he had never been a perfect athlete in the way the world usually defined it. He was not the fastest, not the most agile, did not possess a body created to dominate every situation easily. Even from the very first days, his body had carried limits that others did not have to face: asthma attacks, signs of fatigue, times he had to stop while others continued, all things he could not erase. But what made the difference was not that he had no limits, but that he did not accept letting those limits become the stopping point. His success was not built from perfect moments, but from the times he continued when he should have stopped, from training sessions where he had to force his body to go a little further, from games where he stepped in with uncertainty but still did not back down. Discipline was not a choice, it became a way of life, something that kept him standing when everything else was no longer reliable. Endurance was not a quality he was proud of, but something he was forced to learn if he wanted to survive, and over time, that very thing became the foundation for everything he achieved. There were limits he could never erase, marks on his body, memories of times he could not breathe, moments when everything almost ended, but he had learned to go with them, not to overcome them completely, but so they would not pull him back. And that was exactly what shaped the way he viewed his life, not as a series of victories, but as a journey, where every step forward had to be earned with more than what others could see. When people looked at the titles, at the numbers, at the moment he stood at the peak, they saw the result, but they did not see the path that led there, a path that was not smooth, not certain, full of times he had to wonder if he could continue or not. And that was where his legacy truly existed, not in the titles, not in the records, but in the way he fought to stay when everything around did not support him, in the way he did not let one mistake define him, in the way he continued moving forward even when there was no guarantee where the road ahead would lead. He was not the model of perfection, but the image of a man who did not give up, a man who had accepted that he would never have everything others had, but still decided he would do the best with what he had. And that very decision, repeated through every year, every game, every moment, had created something that could not be measured by numbers, something that could only be felt when looking back at the entire journey. That real strength did not lie in having no weaknesses, but in not letting that weakness decide who he was. And when he continued to live his life after the grass, when he no longer had to prove anything to anyone, that image still did not change. Not because he was still playing, but because of the way he viewed everything around him, with calmness, with acceptance, with an understanding that not every battle needed to be continued, but what he had learned from previous battles would always remain. He no longer needed to run to prove who he was, because that had already been shown in every run he had made, in every time he did not stop when he should have. And when looking forward, he no longer carried the fear of being left behind, no longer the feeling of chasing something that was leaving, but simply continued, in a different way, slower, quieter, but no less steady. Because if there was one thing his journey had proven, it was that moving forward was not always running faster or stronger, but sometimes just not stopping, even when everything inside and around said you should stop. And that was exactly the truth that perhaps all of us had felt for a long time, that Jerome Bettis had never been a perfect athlete. He was just a man who never allowed himself to stop. And that was exactly what had taken him farther than any perfection could. The story of Jerome Bettis is not just the journey of an athlete, but a painful testimony to the price of perseverance in a world that waits for no one weak. When looking back at details like the silent asthma attacks, squeezing every breath, training sessions that had to stop midway, or the fumble moment that almost made his entire career collapse, people cannot help but feel heartbroken for a man who had to fight not only against opponents, but also against his own body. The peak of that inner conflict was the final season, when he stepped into every game with a body that was no longer intact, accepting the trade-off of his health just for the chance to reach Super Bowl 40 right at his hometown Detroit, where all childhood memories came back. The moment of victory was not just glory, but liberation after a long journey filled full of endurance, and that made this story carry a very humanness, because it reminds us that success sometimes does not come from perfection, but from not giving up when he should have stopped long ago. For the American people, where the spirit of competition and individual effort is highly valued, this story not only inspires but also raises an important question. Are we pushing ourselves past limits for the right goals, or just because we fear being left behind? Bettis shows that discipline and will can take a person very far, but also reminds us that every journey has a price. And what matters is not only winning, but understanding when to continue and when to stop to keep oneself. If Jerome Bettis' story makes you think about your own limits and will, please hit subscribe and like to continue accompanying journeys as real as this one. Thank you for listening until the end, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore people who move forward, even when life said they should stop.